Okay, I'm Steve Fowl. I'm professor of theology at Loyola University, Maryland. I've been there for 27 years. Well, that's a complicated question, I suppose, in some ways, but because we're a department of theology, everybody is a theologian in some ways. I consider myself, which may not be the best sort of source for this, a theologian who specializes in the New Testament, as opposed to, say, a theologian who specializes in Thomas Aquinas or in Karl Barth or something like that. And I think that's the way we in our department would think about each other. Somebody who has technical expertise in a set of texts or a historical figure, but who always is engaged in the work of theology. And that's probably the way I would consider, what I would consider myself, a theologian who has a specialty in the New Testament. Certainly, universities, as they've become more specialized, sort of help that process of fragmentation, not just in theology, but in all of the disciplines. The university's rewards, the advantages, the promotions and things that the university hands out often go to those who specialize very narrowly and can generate research based on that. So that's sort of one trend that happens within universities generally. Theology, of course, has become increasingly fragmented in the modern era, and biblical studies participated in that, and then also has become more fragmented as a fragment of theology, so that now you could easily be a biblical scholar and a very successful one and an important biblical scholar, but have no direct contact with theology at all. There are some advantages of that too, in that you get some very important, specialized, technical research that that's interesting and advances one's thinking, but it keeps theology and biblical studies at arm's length. One of the things I've always, probably not always, one of the things I've dedicated a vast portion of my professional career to is trying to reunite scholarly study of the Bible and theology. Our department has helped in that because we all teach Introduction to Theology. There's nobody who gets out of that. We have to do it. We enjoy, in some respects, doing that together. And so you can't be too specialized. You can't walk off into your own silo and simply operate there as if the rest of the department didn't exist. And what it does is provide each of us with that challenge to be theological within our own specialties. So that's another factor. And then the third factor there would be almost everybody who engages the Bible engages it because they are believers. And they bring theological interests and concerns to the text. And I want my work to be of use to them and to be of use to the church more generally. And so you have to be able to bridge the gaps between theology as people are living it in churches and congregations and the text of Scripture. So those would be three factors that have all operated. But certainly for me, it's this sense that I want my work to be of use to an audience that is going to read the Bible with the idea that this is going to make a difference in their faith and practice. Yeah, that was, in a sense, we were both sort of beginning our lives as scholars, and we realized that in the churches we both worshipped in and in the broader church where we engaged in the life of the church, that there was an opportunity to refocus the way people were reading Scripture, both both in terms of keeping Scripture and theology, or in this case, Scripture and ethics, kind of apart from each other, and most importantly, in thinking that the Bible is a book that I read by myself and embody by myself. And the central thing we wanted to bring out from that, in writing that book, I suppose, is that although Christians should study the Bible on their own, the tasks of embodying Scripture in faith and practice are tasks for communities, not for individuals. That Scripture is written to communities by and large, and that it plays a role in the life of communities. And it's a very modern phenomenon where we think of individuals reading and appropriating Scripture simply for themselves. And Scripture wasn't written that way, and it's too difficult to embody that way. Christians are invited in their reading of Scripture to both take on ideas and concepts and doctrines, but also to understand that those concepts and doctrines have implications for the way they live their lives, for the way they worship and practice as believers. And so Scripture is not simply to be learned as an intellectual exercise, but to be embodied in terms of what one does in one's daily life, how one worships, how one prays, how one's relationship with God and others is intimately tied to the way one interprets Scripture. And seeing Scripture as sort of one of, if not the chief vehicle for bringing us to our true home in God, it requires us to live it, to embody it, to not only keep it as an intellectual exercise, but to have it shape all aspects of our lives. Well, yes. I mean, certainly I don't want to go back to living without penicillin and cars, though maybe not cars, but electricity, and all of those aspects of life in the modern world are, we can't undo them. In a scholarly sense, also, we can't undo the investigations, scientific, historical, social, cultural investigations that marked both the rich scholarly heritage of the modern university, but also generated a sort of fragmentation at the same time. My sense is that Christians have no stake in denying those advances, and they ought to take them up and use them to do the things that God is calling them to do as believers, so that there's no aspect of human learning or human endeavor that should be out of bounds to Christians. Now, they may not always want to take it up. They may want to speak a word of judgment into some of these things. But the fragmentation that modernity also brought with it is also an opportunity to bring those theological convictions that were once so central to the intellectual life back into the intellectual life, where they have at least a place. They may not ever have that sort of dominant place that they would have had in pre-modern times, but they now have a rightful place in our fragmented intellectual world, and Christians have no reason to shun the other aspects of modernity, but they have an opportunity now to bring their theological convictions into the academy and engage them as serious intellectual disciplines. So it's both modernity both fragmented things, but also provides some opportunities as well, and I think that's important. The other part, I suppose, is that the modern world poses new sets of challenges that Christians haven't had to engage before, and they need to be able to have a set of theological lenses for seeing what's going on around them in theological terms, because if you don't do that, if you don't cultivate that theological way of seeing the world around you, you're going to end up adopting somebody else's lenses. That's simply going to happen. You're going to either form a theological outlook or something else is going to form your outlook. There's no God's eye view where you can abstract yourself and look down on things. And that's one of the things that postmodernity has provided for us, is the sense that there isn't a God's eye perspective, but you then need to adopt a sophisticated, robust theological perspective. And if you don't do that, something else is going to form it for you. I would say that's a deformation of the idea of sola scriptura. I think to the extent that I understand the Reformers' emphasis on this, they never assumed that one would just be able to immediately confront Scripture and through that confrontation or through that engagement access the first century or the first century church. It was a Christian that was already deeply formed catechetically, spiritually, through prayer and worship, that could confront Scripture and use it as a resource. The more modern version of that, the Bible alone is all we need, is a more recent, and I think perhaps maybe a more American way of dealing with that issue. But I think at its root, sola scriptura is not Scripture in isolation from all the other practices of the Christian life, but Scripture governing and shaping all of those other practices that then allow a Christian shaped by that to go and engage Scripture. And so there's a bit more of a back and forth between Scripture and spiritual formation in a way that we may have sort of ruled out the spiritual formation bit, partly because there's always this deep interest that it would be nice if everybody could just simply read Scripture without that formation. And that's probably a dangerous thing if we cultivate that in churches. I wouldn't want to say just that. I wouldn't want to say that you have to be virtuous in order to relate to the text, because in that case, none of us are ever going to quite get there. But I think what I take it that you're getting at is this idea that our lives with God need to be moving in a particular sort of direction, and that the closer we're moving to God and the more we're developing our love of God in our prayer life, in our daily activities, and of course cultivating our love of neighbor at the same time, the better we're going to be able to read Scripture and have it shape our lives. That you don't want to wait to start reading Scripture until you've attained virtue, on the one hand, but the reading has a capacity to form us, and that in forming us, we become better readers to go back to the text of Scripture. And so there's this back and forth is about the spiritual formation that occurs to us in lots of areas of our lives, in worship, in living together with other believers, in our workplaces, in our prayer lives. All of those things can make us better readers of Scripture. And in the course of reading Scripture, it will make us more virtuous. And then that enables us to go back to Scripture and read it better. And so there's always this movement. But that movement is not directed ultimately towards mastering the text of Scripture so much as moving ever closer to God, into ever deeper love of God and neighbor. That's the end point. And I think one of the challenges that Christians, particularly Christians in churches that don't have a rich liturgical life, can see reading the Bible as an end in itself, rather than as an element in this process of growing in ever deeper love of God and neighbor, so that reading and understanding Scripture becomes the end in itself, rather than Scripture being a part of that journey into ever deeper love of God and neighbor. It's a circle. Maybe people often use the word of a spiral because the circle just stays in the same plane, whereas the spiral can move upwards closer to God. Of course, it can also move downwards too. And so, yeah, I like that idea that interpretation is not something you want to finish. If you see interpretation as something that has an end, you're going to answer this question and then stop. You're going to end up treating the Bible and its interpretation as an end in itself. But if it's part of an ongoing interplay, an ongoing conversation, in a sense, you never want it to end. You want to do it better, but you don't want it to end. Certainly there are times when you might bring a very specific question before the text of Scripture with the idea of helping you live more faithfully. But you wouldn't want to then just stop, having received an answer, discerned an answer, and discerned it in community, not on your own. You wouldn't want to then just stop engaging Scripture on this issue. Down the road, you'll be a different person. You'll be in a different context. The world will be different. You're going to need to go back and re-engage the text. And so you always want that back and forth to be ongoing, rather than a sense that I've mastered this, now I can move on to the next book of the Bible, or now I can move on to the next question I have. Our questions can receive answers in Scripture, but those won't be the only questions we ever want to ask. If we do, we're truncating our life with God needlessly, it would seem. Yeah, certainly communities can replicate all of the problems that individuals have when they read the Bible. And so it's fair to ask, well, how then do communities correct, open up themselves to words from outside? Well, part of the way you do that is by recognizing you and your community are not the whole of the church. That if you confess a belief in the Catholicity of the church, you're going to recognize that you have connections, and commitments, and obligations even to Christians far and wide across the world. And it would be important to listen to them, to hear what they have to say. And obviously now with the technology that's available to us, we can do that in ways we could never do before. So the Catholicity of the church ought to work to open up individual communities to a broader discussion, to words of encouragement and words of judgment from other aspects of the church that a community can open itself up to. So there's that sense of the Catholicity of the church, and then, of course, the communion of saints that is also part of that confession. Reminds us that we're not the first people to try and do this, to try and live faithfully as Christians. And so if the Catholicity sort of operates in our world to expand the horizons geographically, the communion of saints expands those horizons temporally and enables us, to hear words of encouragement, judgment, edification from faithful believers in the past. And in those ways, the communities in the present that are reading the Bible and have the tendency towards insularity, and I think that's something that is a very real tendency, can at least open themselves up to hearing new things. The third component of that, of course, is that when Christians finish their worship, they are sent out into the world. A world that they're called to minister to live with, and to live in a way that draws the world back to God. And in drawing the world back to God, you're going to hear from folks that are different from you. that are bringing different perspectives, different questions, different pain and different sorrow, as well as different sorts of joy into your midst. And as long as you are welcoming them, both reaching out and then welcoming them, you're going to have a set of resources that are going to combat your tendencies to insularity. The community that is not reaching out in that way and opening itself to that rich diversity of folks that might want to come in runs the risk of becoming insular. I've just come back from sabbatical, which was a really rich time, and I'm close to finished, I think, a book on idolatry. And it really comes out of teaching our students. When we begin Introduction to Theology, we almost always start with the Old Testament. Certainly, I always start with the Old Testament. And most of our students come with very little prior exposure to the Bible. Even if they've been churchgoers, they've not really experienced the Bible in any sort of way that they recognize. So they read the Pentateuch and they're really captivated by it often, and at least intrigued by it. And then we would get on to the prophets, and things start to fall apart for them there. And they just say, well, this couldn't have happened this way, could it? I mean, God had done so much wonderful work with these people in the Pentateuch. How could they have become idolaters? And it took me a couple of years of engaging them with this, of trying to figure out what their problems with reading the prophetic texts were before I figured out some ways forward. And I began by asking, well, how many of you went to Catholic schools? And about anywhere between 50 and 60% of our students did. And I said, well, how many of you said the Pledge of Allegiance every day in school? And they all did. The Catholic schools still did that. And I said, well, based on what you've read so far in the Pentateuch, I think you can answer this question. What does the God of Israel call it when the people of God pledge their allegiance to something that isn't God? You know, of course, they start staring at their feet and fidgeting in their chairs, but eventually one of them will say, well, idolatry. And I said, good. Now, I want to leave aside just for a moment whether saying the Pledge of Allegiance is idolatrous. It's an interesting question, but it's not the one I'm really interested in. What I want to ask you now is, for how many of you is this the very first time in your life that you thought that saying the Pledge of Allegiance might be idolatrous? And of course, every hand goes up. And I said, well, that's how idolatry happens. Nobody in ancient Israel, nobody in the New Testament, nobody in Baltimore in 2015 wakes up and says, today I'll worship a false god. Idolatry happens through a set of habits that you accrue, a set of dispositions, a set of decisions, a set of practices that you take on over time that slowly, incrementally direct your attention away from God towards something that isn't God. And so what I want to do in this book is use biblical examples of what those habits and dispositions look like and how they get embodied in Scripture. And then also use a set of biblical examples to show habits and dispositions that you can cultivate to resist that tendency towards moving into idolatry. And so the book is sort of laid out in terms of a disposition that would incline you to idolatry and then a way of resisting that. And it's sort of a back and forth between those things. And it moves really over the whole body of Scripture. Well, it's not that I can't name one. It's just that I could name loads. So like a 4 that are immediately coming to mind. And of course, one I should just mention, when I was in college, I had a professor, Roger Lundeen, who was getting very excited about hermeneutics, and shared that with his classes, but with me in particular, and spent a lot of time with me. He was, when I was a senior in college, he met with me and 2 other students, and we worked through the entirety of Truth and Method, slowly, hours and hours in his office. And Roger died a week ago, very suddenly, very surprisingly. And I've always had an enormous intellectual debt to him, simply for the time he spent with me, and sharing his excitement over a sort of new intellectual vista for him with me. When I was in graduate school, Mark Brett and Gerald West were colleagues. They came from different parts of the world, and our friendship together enabled each of us to do better work than we ever would have done on our own. And it really sort of solidified this sense that friendships are a central part, not only of the Christian life, but of the academic life. And we made each other better scholars and better people through our friendship. My colleagues at Loyola, probably more than anyone else, have helped shape me as a theologian and a theologian for the church. None of us go really to the same churches, but in our Monday to Friday interactions, both as colleagues, as teachers, and as scholars, they have taught me enormous amounts of how to do scholarly work, how to care for students in a way that's appropriate to being a professing believer, how to work together in ways that both advance the life of our university, but also advance our lives together as Christians, and how to mingle the rigors of hard work with the joys of living together. To the extent, we began by you asking me if I'm really a theologian, and to the extent that I am a theologian and that anyone else would recognize me as a theologian, it's because of my colleagues, the folks who've sort of sat with me at the lunch table at Loyola for 27 years.